Welcome to Jaipur Literature Festival 2023 at Bank of... We're delighted to introduce first edition, True to Their Salt. Ravindra Rathee, Shashi Tharoor Swapan Dasgupta in conversation with David Olusoga. I would call upon all of them to the stage. May I please? Ladies and gentlemen, give them a big hand. Ravindra Rathee, David Olusoga, Swapan Dasgupta, and Shashi Tharoor. True to Their Salt is a radical retelling of how India came to be colonized by a handful of Europeans in the 18th century, how the British held sway over the country for almost 2 centuries, and their sudden departure from India in 1947. All told from the perspective of Indian soldiers. The British held India by an army predominantly comprising of Indian soldiers and relied on their fidelity. This loyalty stood the test of time, but was eventually breached during the Second World War, leading to the India's independence. It's not just a story of war and bloodshed for another country. It's an in-depth survey of the professional layers that involve the running of military form, recruitment to story structures, and from how Indian soldiers preserved their faith to how they dealt with their frustration at the racism they encountered. Ravindra Rathee started his career as a journalist with Times of India in Delhi, writing on human rights and conflict resolution. After graduating from St. Stephen's College in Delhi, he did an MA in politics at the University of Hull as the British Chevening Scholar. For the past 2 decades, he has worked as a banker. True to Their Salt, the British Indian Army and an Alternative History of Decolonization is his first book, stemming from extensive research on the military life of his grandfather. David Olusoga is a British-Nigerian historian, an author, a presenter, a BAFTA-winning filmmaker. He is a professor of public history at the University of Manchester and writes for The Observer, The Guardian, and New Statesman. Olusoga has written several books, including the award-winning books Black and British, A Forgotten History, and The World's War. Shashi Tharoor, a third-term member of the parliament from Thiruvananthapuram, is the best-selling author of 24 books, both fiction and non-fiction. Besides being a former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and a former Minister of State for Human Resources Development and for External Affairs with Government of India. He has won numerous awards, including the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, a Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Crossword Lifetime Achievement Award in 2019. Dr. Tharoor was also awarded the Sahitya Akademi Award in the category of English non-fiction for his book, An Era of Darkness. He has previously chaired the Standing Committee on External Affairs and the Committee on Information Technology. Swapan Dasgupta is a political activist, a media commentator on current affairs. He was the Member of Parliament from 2016 to 2022 and is a member of the BJP National Executive. His book, Awakening Bharat Mata, The Political Beliefs of Indian Right, was published in 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to have all these luminaries on stage, and give them a big hand of applause, please. We will begin with unveiling of the book first, because all 4 are there. Can we have the book launch music, please? And I request all of you, please, to unveil Ravindra Rathee's book. book, True to Their Salt. Thank you so much. Now the floor is with David Olusoga. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with you all to not just launch this book, and JLF is quite clearly the place to launch your book, but to celebrate this. It is a pleasure to be asked to moderate this discussion, particularly because I've enjoyed reading True to Their Salt so much. And there's a very important subtitle to this book. This is not a work purely of military history. It is a much more important book than that. But we'll come to that subtitle. But I'd like to begin by asking you, Ravindra, when we think of the many resources that the British Empire extracted from India, we think of cotton, we think of textiles, we think of the captive markets for British goods. We have tended not to focus so much on military manpower. And this book is to adjust and to correct that oversight.
Correct. Thank you, David, and thank you, Shashi and Swapan, for joining the launch, and thank you, audience, for your participation. So you're right that the focus when it comes to the exploitative nature of the British imperialism has been on commodities and the financial implication of that. But the key way in which British Empire benefited from India was to provide them and to enable them to have a global military force for which they did not pay a penny, because all of this was actually financed by the Indian Exchequer. Almost 50% of the Indian Exchequer over 200 years went to the military budget, and that is a shocking figure. Even today, Britain's defense expenditure is about 3%, 3.5%. But during those 2 centuries, it was not different from what it is today. And actually, the defense expenditure after 47 rose because they had to actually pay for their own defense during the Cold War. So, they had this access to the military resource, which, because Britain was a small country in terms of population, in 1700, compared to its rivals, so France was the main rival in the early 18th century. Population of France was 2.5 times of UK in 1700. In 1800, it was still 1.5 times. Only in 1900 does Britain actually catch up in terms of population of France. And when the productive capacities of societies did not differ as much as it does today, your economy and your wherewithal to run wars and to conduct campaigns of conquest is simply a factor of how many men you have in your population. That's one element. It was a small country which was engaged globally, but with a very limited recruitment pool, one item. But the more important thing is that nobody actually wanted to be a soldier in Britain. It's not a profession that people aspired to in Britain. Now, for last 1 century, things have changed because of the total involvement of the British population in the First and Second World War, and you have, the preeminence that they give to military, the memory, and all those celebrations. But previously, they had to get prisoners, force the prisoners, give them a choice. Either you serve in the military or you get a longer sentence. If you could not pay your debt in 18th century, sort of early 18th century, you could be drafted into the army. So a country which had a limited population, a very small budget, managed to have a global military reach, which no other country, I would claim, even to date, has been able to command. US comes somewhere close, but nowhere close to what Britain had. And we don't understand that, and we don't, we need to do more work on this fiscal military linkages and this benefit that British Empire got from the access to the military talent in South Asia and financing of it without a penny costing Britain.
And Shashi, you've written extensively and passionately about this financial magic trick, as it were. When people in Britain talk about the benefits of the empire, they often talk about the railways. You've written and pointed out that India paid for the railways. It's exactly the same when it comes to the army.
Absolutely. I mean, we literally paid for our own oppression throughout. But the military recruitment was a classic example of this. I mean, to begin with, the proposition that the East India Company came with was very simple. When they came here to India to trade, they actually had to buy goods with their own money. Once they'd conquered, they taxed the local people, took the revenue they extract from them, and used that money to buy whatever they wanted. So in effect, the Indians were paying for these very things that the British wanted to buy in the first place, and the British weren't paying.
And
same with the
being
military.
Forced to do so by an army that they were also paying for.
And the same with the military, because when they built up the forces of the East India Company, there were a lot of mercenaries. I mean, frankly, you know, the classic employment of surplus labor from the land is in the military. You find anybody who's, you know, able to fight, drag him in. And so for many, it was a source of employment. It was mercenary work. But when the British did it much more systematically, they had to bring in a small number of people to be officers to run these people, which were white Englishmen. They had some non-commissioned officers from Ireland and Scotland and so on. But for the most part, everything below that were entirely recruited from India. They were given much lower pay, benefits, conditions, even living accommodations. You pitch tents in a camp, these guys are at the back near the drains, you know, that kind of thing. The treatment was horrible. But yet, these Indian soldiers were deployed everywhere from, to facilitate the expansion of the British Empire from Cairo to Hong Kong. They participated in the 55-day siege of Beijing. They participated in the evacuation from Dunkirk. They were everywhere.
And we'll come on to that later. This is not just an army used to control India. This is an imperial army that travels around the world.
British conquest of the world was made possible by Indian soldiers, as simple as that.
The East India Company, Swapan, as Shashi says, this is a commercial entity that becomes a military force. That transition, that is one of the strangest transitions in all of world history.
Well, it's not only the strangest transition, it's almost a seamless transition. That's, I think, what's amazing about it. And I think Ravindra is quite right in pointing out that the entire basis on which the British Indian Army existed was iniquitous in terms of its structure, in terms of its pay, in terms of the relationship between officers and men, etc. It was completely iniquitous. Yet, the remarkable feature about it is that with such a tiny clutch of Britons, and incidentally, I think the element of Scottish and Irish involvement is sometimes underplayed. I think it was far greater than it's sometimes made out to be. Despite these very small numbers of Britons who were involved in the colonial enterprise, Britain managed to have such an enormous empire, and without too much of hiccups. I mean, there were the odd, 1857 was really a big flashpoint. There
1806, the Vellore Mutiny before that.
Well, that wasn't an enormous one. I mean, 1857 was really the biggest one which took place. And there were some here and there, and in Afghanistan there were sort of big reverses, and which has continued, etc. Now, the interesting point which I often find is that how come this empire was so enormously successful despite having such a crude system of control? And I think that's something we need to ponder over quite a lot. And I think that's one of those things which I think a lot of the more, the new historians haven't paid enough attention. And I think some of the earlier historians paid a bit too much of attention to. So that's the paradox.
Thank you, thank you. One of the stories, and William Dalrymple has written extensively on this along with others, the story of the British in India is the increasing racialization of British control, of the British presence here. And this is true also for the army. It's always inequitous, but it becomes more racially inequitous. Ravindra.
Correct. But it did not start like that. So East India Company and British had been in India for a very long time, from 1600 onwards as traders, but they were law-abiding foreigners paying their taxes, doing their job more or less, trying to raise forts, but they kept getting snapped on the knuckles for doing that by Aurangzeb in 1668. Once they tried to send an army in Bengal, but they was punished and their rights were extinguished. They groveled, they said apologies, and they were allowed to trade again. 1740s is the decade when everything changes. And there's a background to it. We must understand that there was a fault line in India that allowed this transition to happen. The bigotry of the last significant Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb, created a lot of rebellions against him. The Marathas in the south, the Jats around the capital, which was the personal territory of the emperor himself, and obviously the Sikhs, whose fight with the Mughals started a long way back in 1600. And that created this deficient command and control structure within the military edifice of India, which allowed a foreign, even though small, but an organized and coherent force to benefit from it. And that is the background. But in 1740s, there were no more than couple of hundred Indians employed by the East India Company within India. But when they got involved in the politics in South and subsequently in Bengal, within 2 decades, that number went from few hundreds to about 30,000 in 1765. But during those 2 decades, they relied on the Indian soldiers. They considered them as partners. You have one man called Yusuf Khan, and actually he deserves a biography of his own. He was what was called as the leader of all sepoys in India, a title nobody ever has held. And he actually commanded not only European soldiers, he actually had supervision over European officers during that critical decade when the French trading company and the English trading company were fighting for existence in Madras and Carnatic region. Their initial recruitment was war bands. They would hire a subadar, he would come along with his brothers, cousins, nephews, and he would offer his services and get paid a lump sum. And that's how it started. So they relied on these Indian soldiers as real partners during those 2 decades. But once the French were extinguished by the end of the 7 Years' War, early 1761, 1762, and when they were able to see that the Indian powers, especially the two, the Nizam and his subsidiaries in South, and the Nawab Bengal is within their power, it changed immediately. One of the first things that Clive did was he made sure that the Indians do not reach officer ranks anymore. When they started to form companies, they put British officers in charge of those companies, and the war bands that earlier existed, which was commanded by these native officers, became subordinate to the European officers. And that continues all the way till about 1800, when the Indian officers are actually in this no man's land in between. They're not quite sergeants, because their rank is Subedar, Jamadar, and so on and so forth, but they are subservient even to a new conscripted ensign from England who's probably about 20 years old. And that is the story of how they actually control, by making sure that the command and control of the army, which had gone out of Indian hands, which had disintegrated from the Mughal state, passed on to European officers. And that created this racial hierarchy that persisted all the way till Second World War, and we'll come to that, but Second World War is a transformational revolution in the structure of British Indian Army, and that is responsible to a great extent for the independence of India that the historians need to research more and understand better.
Shashi.
Well, I must say that this is important, everything Ravindra said. What's striking about this is that his title is True to Their Salt, which is a very Indian concept, this namak halali. That there used to be the slogan of Naam Namak Nishan, that is honor, loyalty or fidelity, and the flag. I mean, those were the elements of that united armed men in military forces. The Indians took it seriously, and they were totally true to their salt. The British were equally, truly untrue to they were, if you like, namak haram, because what often happened was not just that they mistreated the Indian soldiers, underpaid them, but they often abandoned them. And Ravindra's book actually shows that. There were a number of episodes.
These are some of the most shocking aspects of this book.
The moment they came under withering fire, it was every white man for himself. and let the Indians take the hindmost, as it were. That was essentially the attitude, and it happened repeatedly. What's striking is that the Indians, and maybe this is what Swapan was talking about, how there was implicitly a lot of collaboration, the extent to which the Indians still stayed true. And until the Indian National Army came about after the collapse of the British Indian forces in Southeast Asia, until then, there weren't any major defections, as it were, to turn against the British. In fact, there were even Victoria Crosses won by Indian soldiers for saving British officers' lives, for dragging wounded men away from the battlefield under machine gun fire. You will not find a single example, not one, of a British officer getting a Major Gallantry Award for saving an Indian. That wasn't it. It was always the other. The traffic was one way. And you had things like the poem Ganga Din, you know, you're a better man than I am, Ganga Din, because you saved my life. Naturally, you are a better man than I am. I didn't do anything to save yours. But this sort of stuff kept happening. And I have to say that when you look back on this period, that's one of the most striking things. You always hear about camaraderie and comradeship in the army. The racial divide came right across and stopped that.
Well, I think he's quite right in talking that paternalism, as we know it, was completely hollow, especially when under attack. And I think it was quite in evidence during the Afghan wars, the retreat from Kabul. It was also in evidence in Mesopotamia to a very large extent. We know about Gallipoli, but we haven't really spoken about how the Indians suffered the same sort of fate in Mesopotamia. And Singapore. And I think really in Singapore, the story of the surrender in Singapore really has got to be rewritten in some way to find out how the Indian forces were left to their own devices. Now, what I find very perplexing given this context is that in 1857, after the Brits more or less managed to quell the mutiny, quell the revolt, the retribution was savage. It was really quite horrible. And I mean, we talk about the German occupation of Russia in the 1940s and the type of oppression which was suffered, and I think it was more or less like that. But what's amazing at the same time is that the British Empire actually emerged far stronger after 1858 than it had been during the time of the East India Company. And that's the puzzle. And that's the political issue, which I think historians sometimes, and particularly Indian historians, are sometimes a bit loath to actually frontally address as to what exactly happened. Were we true to the salt of the British and less true to the salt of India? And I think that's a very embarrassing question, which historians sometimes tend to ignore, and how the Victoria Crosses were won in World War I, and how, despite the lack of opportunities to become officers in the Indian Army, we still aspired to get to Sandhurst, and we still created the IMA, which was modeled on that. And
it's loyalty to an individual, right? The King Emperor. There's a line in Ravindra's book about the Prince of Wales saying something along the lines of, at the end of the First World War, all these Indian soldiers who gave their lives to fight an enemy of whom they knew nothing, other than that he was the foe of the King Emperor of England.
The King Emperor was actually elevated to some, deified status, and that's the puzzle, really, which I think we need to explore.
And Ravindra, you do explore this in your book. How do Indian soldiers manage to stay loyal, at least to themselves, and find a way of existing in this complicated world of mixed loyalties, particularly after 1858?
Correct. So in the chapter True to the Salt, I actually explored this. So in terms of the value system that drove soldiery in India, it is, I would say that you could talk about honor, you could talk about shame, you could talk about a lot of other values and traits, but the central theme that drove these soldiers and informed the culture of soldiery in India is really renunciation. And renunciation, to me, is the central ideal of the South Asian society going back to millennia. So European societies are based around individualism, and a couple of, liberalism is an added acquisition and many other things. But the core ideal of Indian society, South Asian society, has been renunciation. Now, renunciation, it's the source of the power of a yogi, of a king who is an ideal Kshatriya, and also a soldier. So your power lies in not just being able to acquire and hold, but your power also lies in your ability to walk away, discard, and provide no value to the material benefits of this world when the time comes to prove what is right for you. And dharma actually which is an uncoded set of values and duties that everybody seems to understand in the right context, but it's not been coded down like it is in many other religious texts, tells you that you ought to protect and uphold dharma because you had the privilege to hold weapons. Now, unfortunately, India had been an unequal society, segmented society, as it was earlier and as it is today. But a counter of that is that the privilege to hold the weapon was not available to everybody. And those who had this privilege, i.e. quote-unquote Kshatriyas, they held that weapon to uphold dharma. And when all your physical acts in this world were not able to uphold the dharma, you had this last act of sacrificing, of giving away and walking away from the life and this world because you could not uphold what you had to uphold. And so that is the underlying principle that informed. Now, I'm not saying that every soldier was so inspired by this ideal, and there's nobody on the other side who does not get informed or moved by these ideals. But I'm talking about the generic philosophy that underlined the thinking of most of these soldiers. So, and that, one of the key part of dharma is to serve your master who provides for you, for your family, stay true to the salt, in the sense that salt was a way of collecting your pay, salarium in Roman armies and so on and so forth. If you've been paid to look after your family, to look after yourself, then you got to do the job and you got to do it well. And if you could not do it well, you had to let go of what you hold most dear to yourself as a man, and that is your life. And that's the ideal that inspired the Indian soldiery for such a long time, and they did not distinguish between the masters. In Europe in the 18th century, you had very clear distinction between Dutch, English, French, German, Protestant, Catholics. In India, it was a melting pot of various races, classes, religions, and so on and so forth. There was consciousness that these people belong to a different religion, but it did not stop soldiers from being employed across the religious divide. And as long as you're employed, and this is the critical point, the point on which most of the soldiers, both Hindus and Muslims, drew the line was their dedication to their faith. As long as your employer does not interfere in your personal life, in following your faith, then you would keep faith with him in the sense that he's paying your salary, you would serve him, no matter what his caste, creed, or religious background is. And that's the broad underlying theme. It does not mean that, obviously, if you are a Maratha prince, the majority of the senior ranks in your army would be Marathas. If you're a Jat king, that would be, the same. But broadly, this principle, this ideal of upholding dharma through renunciation is the core value that inspired most of the soldiers.
Thank you. Shashi, did you want to come in?
No, I think, frankly, there's room for disagreement on some of this, but I think Ravindra, as the author of this book, is entitled to his explanation. And as Swapan said, we can probably explore this further because there are views. There are perhaps alternative explanations, including material ones. But broadly speaking, there is no doubt that, they were acquiescent in their own subjugation.
And there is an increased sophistication among the British about how to better manage this army after 1857. The exploitation is more targeted.
No, wait. Now you're getting into... No, I'm not sure about that. Because, for example, they had a conscious and deliberate policy of divide and rule. Oh, no, so there was all of that. There was the martial racist theory.
Exactly.
So you had actually mono-ethnic regiments, where you had a Mahar regiment, all consisting of people from the Mahar subcaste, or you had the Maratha regiment, all Marathas, or eventually after the defeat of the Sikhs, the Sikh regiments, and so on. All of them, therefore, bonded together by that commonality, but officered by white men. Yeah. So whether that made it far more difficult to make common cause. I mean, the British learned one lesson from 1857, which is don't give the Indians a chance to bury their differences and unite across religion, region, language, etc., which they did. And why was it so important to destroy the last vestiges of the Mughal emperor? Because the Mughal emperor, to everyone's surprise, because he was a feeble old man writing poetry, suddenly became the acceptable symbol to all, Hindus, Muslims, people from Jhansi and people from Meerut. Everybody rallied around the Mughal emperor as a symbol of their revolt against the British. So they destroyed the symbol. I mean, the British did all of this pretty systematically and ruthlessly. I'm not sure that one can entirely overlook that in coming up with these explanations.
No, absolutely. I mean, the British react to 1858 with trying to not make those same mistakes again.
Well, of course they do. There's a far more sophisticated system of control which evolves. And I think there's one other aspect which I think when we talk about the use of the Indian troops overseas, whether it's in quelling the Boxer Rebellion, whether it's in policing the Suez Canal or parts of Africa. I think the idea is that at some point after 1858, the idea of an autonomous British Indian Empire really started taking shape, which was distinct from the empire which was controlled by Whitehall.
This is the sub-imperialism.
Yeah,
idea.
this is a sort of, you can call it sub-imperialism, you can call it an autonomy of India. I think, Curzon was probably the most articulate and most clear-headed spokesman of that trend. But I think this idea that India, the British Indian Empire, controlled very much from either Calcutta or subsequently Delhi, had a momentum which is different from the interests of Whitehall. Whether that played some role, may not have played a role in terms of evolving the idea of dharma or evolving the idea of renunciation, but it certainly did have some role in creating a commitment of India, or the Indian native princes particularly, and we're in Jaipur, and we can see how places like Jaipur contributed quite substantially to even the Boxer Rebellion, or in World War I and World War II, how that sort of got into the, a new system was evolved. And I think that's part of the overall control which you're talking about, of how the empire was actually taken. It depended a bit more than pure coercion.
No, true, but at the same time, I part company with you only on the point when you said departing from the interests of Whitehall. The interests were the same. There was, you're right, momentum. There was an administrative coherence coming out of Delhi. But for example, it's very interesting when World War I broke out in 1914, a bunch of Indian soldiers who were on a ship to go to Cairo for the Egyptian and Sudanese empire, they were suddenly diverted to Belgium because there was a war brewing. They didn't even have clothes for the European winter. They went there, and they're the ones who actually stopped the initial German advance at Ypres and so on. And these are chaps who were actually, ordered by Delhi, recently the new capital, to go to Egypt, and they ended up in Europe. So the interests of Whitehall still predominated. It was obviously Britain's imperial interests that always came first.
I'm aware of time. Ravi,
very quickly, I think David made an important point, that there's a distinction between 1857 and why Indians did not succeed at that time and why they succeeded during the Second World War. The three key instruments through which Britain controlled Indian army, one was the religious and other caste and class differences, and they were able to overcome that during 1857, Hindus and Muslims united. The second key difference was basically the weapons of Indians were always inferior. But in 1857, they helped themselves to the armory in Delhi, and that difference was extinguished. The most important, the critical way of controlling Indian army was not to allow Indians to have field experience and not to let them officer in the field. And in 1857, you see it again and again. You have the Prince Jawan Bakht, initially the commander of Delhi forces. He is no good. Then you have the Meerut cavalry commander who was brought in to lead these forces. He has had, again, no experience. And that's the reason why the Bengal army soldiers did not succeed, because they did not have an officer who had the field experience. During the Second World War, obviously, from just about 300 Indian commissioned officers in 1939, you had a situation where at the end of the war, there were about 15,000 Indian commissioned officers who'd actually commanded field units, and they had that experience, and that's what changed the British Army. British Indian Army during the Second World War, and the last instrument of control slipped out of British hands. British are practical people. They understood this. They understood that the British Indian Army at the end of the Second World War is absolutely different from any time from 1740s till 1939, and that's why the independence came so quickly after the war.
Thank you very much. I'm flattered that 7 years after Brexit, you still think the British are practical people, but we won't cover that. These two wars in the 20th century, they forced this system to compromise. In the First World War, as Shashi was saying, Indian soldiers are rushed to the Western Front. There was a very viable historical question about whether the British Army could have stayed in France, could have built the Western Front and saved Ypres without those 140, 150,000 Indian soldiers. But they are there fighting white European soldiers. Now, the Indian Army has been transported all over the empire, but to fight non-white people. This is the first compromise.
Yes.
The Second World War demands even greater compromise because there has been a campaign since the 1880s to Indianize this army that has been strongly resisted. Tell me how in the Second World War, Ravi, this attempt, this important line that Indians must not be commanding white soldiers, that Indians must not be officers in any large numbers, how the extringencies of that war forced the British to abandon that key rule.
Yes. So at the beginning of the Second World War, well, we go back to the First World War. The demand for Indianization started in, it actually started with Raja Ram Mohan Rai when he represented to the committee in London that was taking evidence in 1857. So he was the first one to actually represent that you ought to allow Indians to become officers. Obviously, no heed was paid. And in 1858, when the Queen Victoria proclaimed that everybody in my reign will be treated equal, it was allowed to a certain extent on civil services. So the first Indian civil service servant, ICS, Satyendranath Sanya, was recruited in 1864, and that continued. Even in legislature, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were provincial legislatures where Indians could be elected to reasonable positions of government, but not at the senior-most level. But when it came to the leadership of the army, there was absolute no compromise because the British knew that the moment Indians actually have commissioned officer status and they are able to command the sizable body of Indian soldiers, that is a threat to the foundation of British rule in India.
And there's writings that you quote from the 18th century of British officials saying, if we ever allow Indians to control this army, we will lose control of it. This threat was recognized right from the beginning.
Absolutely from the beginning. Clive provided for it. Major Lawrence provided for it as soon as he landed in Madras in 1740s. And he said, no Indian, A, should be allowed anywhere close to the artillery because that's a deadly weapon. And B, we slowly need to make sure that all the official positions are in the European hands. But what happens, interestingly, in the Second World War is that when the war starts, they fall short of men, white men, to be commissioned in the British Indian Army. So they tried to get some Australians, but even that was insufficient. And to have officers in an army of 2.5 million, they had to open the doors for Indians to be commissioned.
So they have to break this golden rule that has been there since the very beginning of the company.
Which was opened just a little bit at the end of the First World War, but the result of about 20, 30 years of this efforts to Indianize one committee, another committee, whether they can actually command white soldiers or they would only be allowed to command Indian soldiers. The result of all that debate, 10 Indians going to Sandhurst each year, making sure many of them actually fail, was only 300 officers in an officer cadre of about 4,000 to 5,000. Can you imagine? Only 3% Indian commissioned officers, or after a campaign of 30 years. And that suddenly changes during the Second World War. You had 15,000 Indian commissioned officers, and that army, to any European, looked very different from the army that they were used to previously. And that's why you see the result that India gets independence so quickly, whereas British fight tooth and nail in Kenya, murdering, maiming, killing people to stay during 50s in Malaysia again. And forget about 50s and 60s. Even today, the YouGov poll suggests that many of the Britons would actually like to have an empire. I mean, what's there not to like to have an army of slaves serving you? There was no reason they gave independence to India in 1946, except for the fact that there's a realization that you could not rely on this army to ensure the safety of European life and limb. And that's what I cover in the last chapter.
And this is the really radical and profoundly powerful conclusion of your book. that what happens in 1947 is sequentially Britain loses control of India because it has lost control of the army that had been created all those years ago by the company. We've got about 6 minutes left for questions.
Can I just make one small point, which is that, you know, sometimes you get an impression, especially if you look at the conduct of the so-called mutineers in 1857 around Delhi, that it's marked by a high degree of ineptitude. Now, the idea that Indians lacked any strategic sense is something which the British tried to bring and consciously imbibe. But there were alternative military traditions which existed in India. There was the Maratha tradition, which suffered a big blow in Panipat in 1761, but was still alive. There was the Sikh tradition, and to a lesser extent, there was a guerrilla tradition, which was there in Mysore under Hyder Ali. So you had these three very, very distinct military traditions which were there, which was consciously snuffed out. And I think one of the tragedies which we have in India is that we have not in any way tried to resurrect some of these traditions which existed. And we've sort of fallen back only on the one tradition which we are familiar with, which is the British Indian tradition.
Thank you, thank you. Questions, please. Can we get a microphone? There's a gentleman here in the front row.
It's a bit of regret that my question is directed to Shashi and Swapan and not to Ravindran. My apologies. Shashi, you made an observation that after 1857 mutiny, it was an unwritten or rather overt policy of British through that divide and rule kind of India. But how do you say that today's government in Delhi is not different, that divide and rule they are doing?
Well, I mean, you're giving me an open invitation to politicize this conversation. I'm not sure that's fair to Ravi, but very briefly, many of us are very concerned that a policy that is anchored in an ideology of Hindutva that seems to favor one particular community at the expense of the rest will indeed divide Indian society and has already shown signs, particularly across northern India, where I don't have to live and work other than to attend parliament. We've seen a lot of signs of this, and this toxin of communalism and communal division does indeed divide the country.
Well, I think sometimes when you have a conscious process of national self-realization, you're likely to get a lot of opposition to that.
I think I've done my own contributions to national self-realization. Swapan, I stand second to none in that
No, I'm
regard.
sure you are, but let's not get into that. We've done that many times before.
There's a gentleman in the black in the third row, please. We've only got a few minutes left, so briefly if you can.
Good afternoon, sirs. So my question is to Ravi sir. You had enlisted 3 reasons. Could be, I mean, I want to get a scholarly view on whether the vagaries of nature and the skewed agricultural relations also contributed to the migration of workforce from India's agricultural landscape towards the military, because Bipin Chandra has also written that the soldier was also invariably a peasant in uniform. So does the moneylender zamindar nexus and also the fact that there was a lot of drought and famine also contributed to the securing the twin objectives of not only recruitment but also land grabbing?
Well, to the extent possible, there are various factors that work at cross sections, and you could never point out that this is the primary factor. But what I would like to point out is that the profession of soldiery since millennia in South Asia had been a very aspirational profession. And you might not be a full-time soldier. You would have a tradition where you could farm for about 6 months and then join the army, and that would be the traditional peasant soldier. But when you came to 18th century, soldiery had to become a full-time profession. And that is one revolution that actually East India Company completed, that you could not have part-time soldiers, you had soldiers who are fully devoted to their profession. So I don't think that this is simply, they were being squeezed because of economic reasons out of their land, and that's why they became soldiers. No, soldiery was a profession in India. this was the way to raise your status. And that status raising, not only at an individual level, you see the communities raising themselves through the force of arms. You have Sikhs and Jats and Marathas in various combination and permutations achieving those aims in 18th century, which were not open to them earlier. So I don't subscribe to, you know, the typical argument that because they were poor, they had nothing else to do and they became soldiers. They became soldiers because this was the aspiration for them, and many of them actually had land to till or other resources in the wider family to fall back upon, and they were not squeezed to become, simply for the economic means, soldiers.
We have time for, well, we have 1 minute left, sir. The gentleman with the microphone, if you can ask a 30-second question and we can do a 30-second answer, we'll be fine.
Okay, my question is to all the 4 panelists. There are 4 books which cover the subject, starting from the beginning of the 19th century, 1800s, 10, to the end of the First World War. They are From Sepoy to Subedar by Sitaram Pandey. Second is 13 Months in China by Gangadhar Singh. The third is the diary of Major General Amar Singh, who's from Jaipur. And the fourth is the biography of Sir Pratap, the famous Sir Pratap of Jodhpur. They cover the subject that you have covered in detail from an Indian's inside point of view. I just want to know from the 4 panelists, you have spoken with great authority, how many of you have read those 4 books?
Yes, so I've actually included, I've included Sitaram Pandey is such an exciting character. I mean, he deserves a biography of his own, or at least a movie. Sitaram Pandey, born in 1797, joined the East India Company Army in 1812. I'll try to be 30 seconds or less, but such a fascinating account Sitaram Pandey left of everything of consequence that happened in India in the early part of 19th century. Thakur Amar Singh from Kanota, absolutely brilliant account. He wrote a diary every single day of his life for 40 years, especially the contingent that went to China to put down the Boxer Rebellion as part of the Jodhpur forces, and how the sting of the racism and all those discrimination, how he felt about it. I've quoted him as well. And there are a number of other accounts. I've crawled and digged wherever I could find an Indian voice, including Deen Muhammad in 18th century and many others, and you would see it in my book.
Thank you very much, Ravi. I'm afraid we're out of time, and it's time to thank my panelists, Ravindra, Shashi, Swapan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
A big hand for such an enlightened and very close kind of a conversation on India's independence from the perspective of Indian military and soldiers. Thank you, Olusoga, for conducting it beautifully, wonderfully. Ravindraji will be happy to sign his books. Please line up on the left of the stage where the kiosk is. And thank you so much as a mark of respect to Ravindra Rathee, to Shashi Tharoor, to Swapan Dasgupta, and to David Olusoga. We're honored to have all of you here. Thank you so much. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen.